Father, we ask that you would meet us this morning in your word, through your Spirit, with your community. And we ask that you would change us. God, we know this change doesn't happen overnight, but as we walk with you in obedience, God, you change us. And so that's our desire. You would open our minds, open our eyes, open our hearts to the beautiful way of following you. And that as we do that, you would change us more and more into the image of your Son. We ask that you would do it. We pray it in your name. Amen. What do you want in life? Like if we sat down and had a conversation and it got philosophical, theological, spiritual, and it said like, what do you really want in life? And if I said, if you could just pick one word to answer that question, what do you want in life? Just to yourself, what would the one word be that you would say back to me in this conversation? There's a recent blog by an author named Kathy Caprino entitled The Top 10 Things People Want in Life But Can't Seem to Get. What do you think the number one answer is? She surveys over 1,600 people from around the world asking them that question, man, what do you want in your life that you just can't seem to get? If you could sum it up in one word, what do you think the number one thing is that people said? What's your guess? I heard somebody say it. Happiness. I want to be happy, right? And there's nothing wrong with the sense of wanting to be happy. We want to be happy. But this is what she says in her research. She says this. She says, the number one mentioned missing element, happiness, has become so hard to achieve, even harder to maintain. In my work with over 20,000 professionals around the world over the past 16 years, I've seen that happiness continually escapes them. Because first, they don't understand specifically what will make them happy. They have a vague idea, but not a specific concrete understanding of what happiness to them really looks like. And the bar to happiness keeps moving for them. Sadly, they often don't seem to know themselves well at all. So her argument in this article that she writes is just this idea of like, okay, people want happiness. They're trying to get happiness. They never feel like they can get there. And her argument is twofold in this statement is going, one, they don't really know what happiness is. They say they want to be happy, but there's no concrete definition of, okay, now I'm happy. The second thing is like, they don't really know themselves. It's interesting, rounding out the top 3 of the top 10 that she has, you know what the number 2 and number 3 things are. If happiness is number 1, what else do people want that kind of eludes them? The second was money, and the third was freedom. Right? Like we want as a culture, as humans, we want to be happy, we want this idea of money, and we want freedom. We think those are the things that are going to give us a fulfilled life. And Charles, last week in a sermon on the back end of 1 Timothy chapter 4, he mentioned that comfort is the primary idol of our culture. Comfort, that we want to be comfortable. That's the thing that we go after. And when you think about your life, how you live it, the goals you have, the decisions you make on a daily basis, are they based on that? Are they based on comfort? Just thinking through how you're going to interact, and maybe it's not even like material comfort. Maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's even a conversation. Man, this is a hard conversation. I don't want to walk into it because it's uncomfortable. And you like comfort, and I like comfort. Or we like indulgence, or being in the idea of indulgence is unrestrained pleasure. And so when you think about your life, how you live your life, the decisions you make, the conversations you have, as you go through your day, even today, will your decisions be made on, is this going to be comfortable? Or if you're a follower of Jesus, you have a very different paradigm than the rest of the world. It's not based on, is this going to be comfortable, but how am I being dependent? What is God asking me to do? Even if it's uncomfortable, which is often the case in following Jesus. The follower of Jesus has a different paradigm for how they live their life, how they answer that question of, man, what do you really want in life? Charles continued in his sermon talking about this illustration where he visited some friends and they were up at Lake Havasu and there was this river, and he talked about how jumping into the river, and there was a local guy that was with him that was familiar we're here last week, and he talked about, hey, when you jump in, you got to realize this current is going to take you strong to the opposite direction. And so when you hit the water, you have to start swimming opposite the current, or else you're going to get pulled away. And he just talked about how that is our comfort is this undercurrent. That, man, if we don't realize, number one, that there is a current, because a lot of us, we just live life and we don't realize how we're being formed and shaped all the time. We're in an invisible current that's pulling us in a direction that's opposite of the way of Jesus. One, we need to recognize there's a current. And two, we need to actively swim against it. If we don't do those things, we're just going to drift. And it's going to take us someplace the world says there's life, but Jesus says, no, that's actually not the way to live. So we have to understand what it means to press against that. And what we're going to see in chapter 5 today, specifically as Paul addresses a specific part of the community in the church, older women, he calls widows. We'll unpack what that means. But here's the big idea that we're going to pull away from the 16 verses this morning is this. The kingdom calls for us to live a life of dependence rather than a life of indulgence. The kingdom calls for us. If you're going to follow Jesus, if you're going to walk with Jesus, there's a specific call, there's a specific expectation, there's a desire for you to be fully human based on living a life of dependence rather than a life of indulgence. And to live a life of indulgence, that's logical. Right? If you ask anybody, man, to have more money, to have more safety, why wouldn't you want that? Why wouldn't you go after that? To live a life of indulgence is logical in our culture. To live a life of indulgence is cultural. It makes sense. It's kind of like the culture would say, you do you and get what is yours. And that everybody would go, yeah, that's how you live life. I was recently watching this documentary on YouTube with my son on the Kia Boys. And if you're not familiar with that term, which nobody probably is in this room unless you're a teenager, the Kia Boys, it's a group of teenagers, youths as you would call them, that they figured out that if you have a flathead screwdriver and a USB port, you can break a window of a Kia car, smash the window, get into it, and they're filming this, how you can do this. It's basically a cheat code for how you boost a car, a Kia car. And you pull this thing down and you put the USB in, it'll start. And so all over the country, there's these youths that are stealing these cars, they're videotaping it, and they're recklessly driving into certain things, trying to sell the car, and then they post it to their social media, and it's become a trend where these kids are stealing cars. And the documentary we were watching, somebody was interviewing them. These three young men, they had masks on, and like, why are you doing this? Well, this is just what you do. Like, why wouldn't we do this? Well, do you feel bad about this? No, insurance will cover it. I'm just trying to get mine. And again, so from my vantage point, didn't have any conversations obviously with these kids, but it doesn't seem like they know Jesus, just a guess from what they're responding to and their actions. So I'm not blaming them. Why wouldn't they do that? Like, you don't blame the dark for being dark. They're not regenerate. They don't know Jesus. They don't have the Spirit inside of them to convict them. Like why wouldn't you live that way if the culture is saying, yeah, you should go ahead. If they get caught, it's a misdemeanor. Slap on the hand because they're under 18 in their state. And the thrill of doing this and the outpay of doing this when they're in a community where it feels like there's no way out, why wouldn't you do that? Like, the world would tell you, live a life of indulgence. But for the follower of Jesus, like, living a life of indulgence might make sense logically, it might make sense culturally, but it doesn't make sense biblically. As we open up the Bible and we see what it means to follow Jesus, to become like him, to do what he does, there's a call to come and to die. There's a call to go like, man, I'm not just going to go after comfort, I'm actually going to go after dependence. And that's what we're going to see in the text this morning. Again, if you're catching up with us, we walked through chapter 4 the last 2 weeks. We have 4 more weeks as we'll walk through the book of 1 Timothy, and we'll jump into the Psalms for 5 weeks of the summer, and then we'll get into the Sermon on the Mount into the fall, just as a landscape of where we're going to go on Sundays. And so we have 4 more weeks walking through chapter 5 and walking through chapter 6. And the last 2 weeks we walked through chapter 4, and Paul is this leader, and he's writing to this young leader of Ephesus, this church in Ephesus named Timothy. It's a personal letter. He's writing to him going like, man, I'm hearing this counterfeit gospel. This isn't true, and people are teaching it. We got to figure this out. And he's giving all kinds of leadership cues to Timothy to help him with this. And then what chapter 4 basically is in a summary is going like, man, before you begin to lead this community, Timothy, you need to learn how to lead yourself. Because if you can't lead yourself, you can't lead other people. I mean, that's just a general fact of life, right? You can't give away what you don't have. And so in chapter 4, he's going, man, Timothy, you have to learn this. He says, lead yourself, train for godliness, set an example in your speech, your conduct, your faith, your love, your purity. Devote yourself to the scriptures. This is the way you train in your godliness. You need to do it consistently. It's going to change you. You have to lead yourself before you lead these other members of the church community. He says in the language in chapter 4, you need to practice these things. He says, immerse yourselves in them. Love that language of immerse yourself. It's like, Timothy, man, you have to learn how to lead yourself in the scriptures before you can lead other people. I don't know if you guys are up to date with some of the trends, not just with stealing cars, but in the fitness trend, the last year or so, it's been kind of a popular trend, especially for men, is cold plunging. I don't know if you guys have seen that, familiar with that. It's basically like you get in this tiny, it's like a cooler, and you submerge yourself. You immerse yourself in this freezing water for like a minute or two. And there's somebody here that's a member, and they kind of have a home gym, and they do all the things, and they're disciplined in their workout. I mean, they're running, they're working out, and you can see this dude looks like a Ken doll. You've probably seen him. You know who I'm looking at. There's a couple of you. It could be a couple of you in the audience. Most of us not, but a couple of you might fit that bill. Anyway, I went to drop something off at his house a couple months ago, and he opened the door. He goes, do you want to do a cold plunge? I was like, yeah, let's do it, man. And so I walked around and got into this. Yeah, there's no way a human should fit into this contraption. And he's got it all dialed in. He's got the temperature, the time, how long you're supposed to be in there. And I set my foot in there. It just feels like 1,000 knives coming at you at the same time. And so it's but you have to get all the way in. You're immersed in the water, and I'm just trying to breathe, and he's kind of coaching me through it. And then I get out after, I don't know, it was a minute or 2 minutes. He had a clock on. And it was not fun. It was uncomfortable. It was painful at the beginning. But man, I feel like a new person after I get out. I don't know if you guys have experienced this. And it feels a little bit like that in the Christian life, man. If you're under the impression that when you come to Jesus, everything's going to be fine, there's not going to be any discomfort, and you're still living your life in a way of comfort and a way of indulgence, man, you're going to be really, really disappointed in your walk with Jesus. There are things that are hard as you love people, and you step into that kind of cold tub, and you immerse yourself, and it's painful at the beginning to have that conversation. Man, to go to that community, to get up and be here, there's a cost for you being in this room this morning. And some of us go, wow, I'm going to stop doing it. It's too costly. Man, to walk with Jesus is costly, but then when you get out of that tub, you feel like, oh, that's what my soul needed. I don't know if anybody you relate, man, I'm tired. This week has been crazy. I know I'm committed to this group, whether it's a Bible study or whether it's my redemption community or whether it's a See Jesus table. I'm going oh, man, I'm tired. And I'm just going to go based on accountability and going I know this is good for me, but there's nothing inside of me that wants to go. And then you go and then you leave and you're like, okay, that's what my soul needed. But if we go, it's just too uncomfortable, we won't get the benefit on the back end. And that's what Paul is telling Timothy in the first. You have to learn how to lead yourself all the time. The counter of that is going well, I'm going to do things that are all comfortable for me, and then you feel bad after. You feel like, oh, why did I just watch 6 hours of Netflix? I feel like less of a human. And so Paul's telling Timothy, man, you need to learn how to lead yourself. Now that you can learn how to do that, immerse yourself in the scriptures. You got to train for godliness. Once you do that now, here's how you lead these groups of people. And then that's where we jump into chapter 5, starting in verse 1. We'll just walk through the text kind of collectively in chunks. Again, 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 1 and 2 say, do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father, a younger man as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters in all purity. Paul's basically giving categories. He's overlaying this idea of this church community should act like your family. There's brothers, and there's sisters, and there's mothers, and there's fathers, and there's ways to interact with different people for different reasons. Pay attention to that, Timothy. And then what he's going to do is he's going to start breaking down some of these subsets. Verse 3. He starts with, and this is where we'll be for the rest of this morning, talking about these older women. And just so you know, before we read the text, he's going to use the word widow And I know when we read that in our modern day, we go, well, yeah, somebody that their husband died. They were married, their husband died. That's how we use the word widow. But in Paul's time, it could be a woman that lost her husband. But really, this term was broader. It really, a widow meant a woman that was left with no resource of family assistance. So maybe she lost her husband. That's certainly the case in a lot of the way that the word widow used. But it's also like, man, maybe she doesn't have a son. Maybe she's single, because in that culture, a woman's value and her security were tied to a male counterpart. And so you have to broaden the idea when we read this together. When he's talking about widow, that's the language. And so this is what he says, starting in verse 3. We'll work through verse 6, and then we'll stop and talk about it. Honor widows, Paul tells Timothy, who are truly widows. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make someone return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplication and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. I'll stop there for a second and unpack what Paul is telling Timothy, this idea that widows that are truly dependent, or if you're reading the NIV, the language is really in need. So like a widow in need is a widow indeed. He's classifying these groups of older women or women without assistance from a male. They have no support. They're fully devoted to God. And again, recognize the setting that we're reading the Bible in. There's no social services. There's no, like, your family takes care of you. And this is even in the early church. I mean, we see this if you're familiar with the story of the Bible in Acts chapter 6. There are these widows that aren't getting the rations of food that the church is promising to them. And they have to figure out a leadership way to make sure people are getting what they need. And this just matters because if you follow Jesus, the way of Jesus is always paying attention to the vulnerable. And these women were vulnerable in this culture. So we say, man, pay attention to the women that are really in need. They're not pretending to be in need, but they actually are in need. And James tells us in verse 27 of chapter 1, what is religion that's pure and undefiled? It's to visit the orphan, to visit the widow in their affliction. Why? Because they're vulnerable. Because they've been cast out. Society says, they don't matter. They don't count. We're not going to deal with them. And Jesus says, no, we will. They are made in the image of God. They have inherent value. And even if the culture would say, it doesn't matter, like Jesus followers go, no, it does matter. We need to love them well. Verse 5, he's talking about this idea, like who is truly a widow? They're forced to pray and believe. Again, their social structure, they don't have any net, they don't have any backing, and so they're going like, okay, I have to depend on God. Whether it's my husband is not here anymore, my son is not here anymore, I'm single, like I have to depend on God. And so you see their actions night and day praying and trusting the Lord. He gives a contrast to another type of widow in verse 6. So there's the true widow that is dependent, and then there's the widow that's indulgent. Look at verse 6 again. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. So he's giving a contrast on purpose. Like there's different women that are calling themselves widows in your culture. You need to know the difference between the two. There's one widow that actually is a true widow. She's depending on God for everything she has. But then there's this other widow that, man, she's self-indulgent. She's not dependent on a man, but she's kind of dependent on culture and all kinds of things. And we've talked about the cult of Artemis at the time, which Artemis would go, don't get married, don't have kids. We talked in chapter 2, like braid your hair this certain way or wear this type of jewelry in your worship that shows your status, that shows your class. And Paul is pushing against that type of activity. I've not seen this show. I've seen the commercials. I don't know if you guys have seen it. You don't have to confess if you have or whatever, right? We watch all kinds of stuff. But like it makes me think of like the housewives of Atlanta or Orange County, or like when I've seen the commercials for, like, I was like, that just seems like a disaster, right? Like, and it's just like materialistic, like, and so it's like, these aren't the housewives of, these are like the widows of Ephesus, right? They're going around, they're self-indulgent. They're not dependent on God. They're dependent on all this stuff. They're dependent on what the culture says gets you the next thing up. And Paul's saying like there's a difference between these two women. And you need to pay attention to it as you do your best to lead the community. There's a widow of indulgence, and then there's a widow of dependence. And we see this modeled in the scriptures when we look at widows, like Luke chapter 2, the Christmas story. We see Anna, who the text says she's a prophetess. She loves her husband, and she loses her husband when she's 84, the text says. And what it says is she did not depart from the temple, worshiping, fasting, praying day and night. She's waiting for a Messiah, an answer for the problem. And she's giving her life to the Lord. And then Jesus shows up on the scene, and they're bringing him into the temple. And the text says of Anna that she began to give thanks to God and to speak of him to all who were waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. The world might say, oh, Anna, her husband's dead. She doesn't have any value anymore. But God says, no, she has massive value. And she's putting her value to use as she prays. And she's asking God for an answer. And she's asking God to send the Savior. And she gets to see it with her own eyes. Just like Simeon right before in that story. And then we see Jesus tell a story in Luke chapter 21 as he's seeing rich people put offerings into these boxes. And then he sees this widow take her 2 copper coins and she places them in. And she says, actually, all that other stuff that has been given even has higher value monetarily. You would understand that. But this widow actually gave more than any of those people. Because she's dependent on God. She has a direct connection to understanding, man, I can't depend on anybody else, anything else. I'm fully dependent on God. And that's the heart that we're called to follow Jesus, is not to be dependent on indulgence, comfort, but be dependent on God. What a beautiful picture we have. And culturally, what the world would probably say, they don't matter. And God goes, no, there's massive value in the widow. The kingdom calls for us to live a life of dependence rather than a life of indulgence. It's interesting, verse 6, what Paul says, the language he uses to Timothy, which is congruent with the rest, really, of the Bible, if you're familiar with it. He just says, she who is self-indulgent is dead while she lives. How are you dead while you live? The Bible's congruent with this language in other places, but there's a difference between being alive and having life. Right, you get that? Like, Jesus comes and he says, man, I'm come to give life and give it to the full. Who's he talking to? He's talking to people that are alive. He's not walking around a graveyard saying that. He's talking to people that are breathing, and you go, well, they seem to be alive. It's like, well, they're alive, but they don't have life. And that's the case with this. These women, man, they're chasing after these things that they think will give them life and their indulgence. And he goes, actually, they're dead. They're spiritually dead. And so for us, that's just a good, healthy kind of check of our heart to go like, okay, am I walking around alive thinking I'm alive, but I'm actually spiritually dead? And if we get to that point, we go, well, like, okay, if that's what I'm hearing, well, then I'm going to make myself alive. And you go, well, that's not a trick that works. Like a dead person can't make themselves alive. You can't just pick up your spiritual bootstraps, from your bones and make your, like, and then you just go, well, what do I do? How do I become alive? And that's the mystery and the beauty of God waking you up to who he is. As the Spirit woos you to himself, as you encounter people that really love Jesus and are sharing about Jesus and go, man, you're going to try and go after all these things to give you life, but it's only until you give your life to Jesus that you really can taste and experience all you were meant to live. That doesn't mean everything's perfect. It actually means things get harder in this world because of sin, because of our own selfishness, because of the brokenness of the world, because we have an enemy against us. But actually, this is where we actually get life. And until you surrender your heart to Jesus through his Spirit wooing you to himself to wake you up, to drop the scales on your eyes to go, it is him. I've been trying all these other things. And somebody keeps telling me, no, it's Jesus, it's Jesus, it's Jesus. He's the great clue. He's the great key to all of life. And when you finally surrender your life to Jesus, you will hit your head on the pillow. Not that everything will be perfect, but you'll go, okay, I have a sense of what I'm doing in the world. Until then, you're walking around living, but you're actually dead. So we have to pray and ask God to meet us in that space, to say, man, I don't want to walk around pretending to be living and actually not have life. I want to know what it means to have life. And that's what Paul is using as a description of these women that are going around trying to get their worth in indulgent things and comfort, and like, that's not it. The widow which again, the culture would go, she doesn't matter. This is the one that matters. She's got all the money. She's got all the things. Like, no, actually, that's the one that has life. Verse 7, he continues. He says this. He says, command these things as well, so that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Again, strong language from Paul here. Right, and one pastor says it this way of this text. He just goes, man, if our current Christianity doesn't work at home, then our Christianity doesn't work. And we've talked about this as we've drilled down on kind of certain standards of leaders in chapter 3, going like, man, you have to manage your household well. He's saying it again here. He's going like, if your Christianity doesn't work at home, the place where you cannot hide, it's probably not working. And we understand, the family dynamics are definitely different in this time that he's writing than how we live. Our family, our nuclear family is different. But I think the point is still valid to go like, are you caring for your family? Like, this is something that makes God happy. And in the direct context, he's talking about, man, how are you caring for your mom that maybe becomes a widow, or your grandmother that becomes a widow? Are you just going, somebody will take care of it? Like, or are you going, no, this is what it means to love and care for my immediate family? And again, all of us are running through the categories of our people in our head right now. And we all have different relationships with our family. And the point is, because some of us just come from toxic homes. Or maybe your family's not around at all, and you go, this doesn't really apply to me. But the point is still clear. Like, man, like if your Christianity doesn't work at home, it's not going to work anywhere else. I think some of the reason that we get tripped up on this, again, is because the current of our, that we step into, whether we recognize it or not, is comfort, is convenience, is indulgence. And so if we swim in that river unknowingly, it's going to pull us away from other opportunities to love our family that's costly to us. Not even monetarily costly, but just emotionally costly. I just go, man, to love somebody that is dependent on you is hard. And again, I think we've overlapped the culture. And we get greedy with our comfort, even if we don't realize it, and that pulls us away from opportunities or even monetarily ways we can help our family. I was in the dentist this week, and my dentist, they're amazing, they're great. They're called the Dental Brothers, and so I think the reason that they do this, like the only thing they show in the waiting room is HGTV, because I think like the Property Brothers, I think there's some kind of like, I guess I'm going like, what's the branding tactic here? I don't really understand, but HGTV, I guess, is as good as anything to have in a lobby as you're waiting to get your teeth fixed or cleaned or whatever. And so I'm watching this show as I'm waiting this week, and it's a show called Love It or List It. I think it's a Canadian show. Shout out to my Canadians, which I think are in Canada right now. They're not even here. But it's a show where there's a realtor, a guy, and there's a gal who's like redesigns your house. And so it's a couple that like they're not satisfied with their living arrangements or whatever. And so realtor comes in and he tries to find other places to buy. And the designer comes in and says, well, I'll fix your problems here. And at the end of the show, they have to make a decision. The couple has to make a decision. Do we love the changes and we love living here, or do we list our house and we move to these other options? That's kind of how the show works. And at the beginning of every show, they have the couple going around to their current house and basically talking about why we don't like living here. And some of the stuff seems like, yeah, the foundation is crooked and that's going to be a problem. This specific couple was mainly the part I caught before I went back into the dentist chair was like they were in their master bathroom that was attached directly to their bedroom, and they were going on and on and on and on again about we only have one sink. One sink? Like I have to wait while she brushes her teeth. I mean, he wasn't saying that, right? But it's like those first world problems, you know? I mean, like one sink in your own bathroom in your bedroom, like that's why you're going to put $100,000 down. Like that's the thing that's going to make you spend all this money because of one sink. And we have two sinks in our. I mean, it's great. It's like in our bedroom, it's great. It's amazing. And so again, I think sometimes when we jump into that current of comfort, we slowly move this want to a need, right? We all do it at some level. And so the whole point is like, okay, we're making all those types of decisions all the time in our life. And if we're going, well, I need 2 sinks, I can't have 1 sink, and then all of a sudden you don't have any money, and your mom loses your dad, and you need to go buy her lunch or help her out, or what? Oh, sorry, Mom, we had to have 2 sinks. It's like, well, that's not. And again, it's like, it's all these little things over time. And so are we paying attention to how we're stewarding the things we have, our emotions, our money, our time? And Paul's point to Timothy is going like, man, you got to love your family. You got to care for your family. Now, maybe your family doesn't want that, and you know, there's only so much you can do. Or maybe, again, some of us come out of toxic relationships or toxic family members where they're like, they're mad that we're not giving them money, and they're taking that money and they're using it on abuse that's not helpful for them. And so maybe your role in that is not just to give them money, and they quote this verse to you, but maybe your role and responsibility is like, man, let's really get you some help. We'll help provide the money for you to get you the help you need. And again, that might be rejected, but that's not on you. What is on you is going like, how am I loving and caring for my family? Because it always comes with a cost. For all of us, it comes with a cost. But the way of the kingdom is not self-indulgence and comfort. The way of the kingdom is dependence. Is to go, okay, how do I depend more on you, Lord, based on this situation and circumstance? Then he continues, and some of us, again, well, one last thing I'll say on that is like, some of us, again, we don't have family here, and the church has become your family. The people in this room, your redemption community, your See Jesus table, your Bible study group has become your family. And I've seen people in this church that a need arises in their community. And the community, they don't go, let's call the church and see if they have money. But they're like, no, let's try and solve it internally. And then if we can't do it internally, then let's go broader and ask if the church has funds or helps with this. And like somebody gave their kidney to somebody else. Not in the group, but their like dad needed a kidney. And this person was like, oh, I don't need both kidneys. Like, oh, let's do it. Right? That's what it means to love each other and live in community with each other, to go, okay, like we're going to be in this even if it's costly to us. He continues on in the next back end of the text. He gets real practical and specific in Paul's and Timothy's direct context. So again, I love the idea that it's been said that the Bible is not written to us, but the Bible is written for us. There's a specific situation that Paul is trying to help Timothy address, but there's still universal things we can apply here. He says this in verse 9. He says, let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, having a reputation of good works. She has brought up children. She has shown hospitality. She has washed the feet of the saints. She has cared for the afflicted. She's devoted herself to every good work. Who are the widows? These self-indulgent widows or these dependent widows? Paul gives this list to understand, man, Timothy, this is how you practically understand who you should be giving to, who you should be surrounding with. Some scholars believe that this was even a list of an office, that just like men as elders, this kind of list, like women as widows, that was the language that they used, and it kind of phased out in the 3rd century because of the language of deaconess. But whatever reason, it's helpful for Paul to go like, man, there's these women that are doing godly things, godly work. Pay attention to them. Help them if they have a need. And let me just say, just as Paul is talking directly to Timothy's context, going, pay attention to this, let me just say for our direct context here at Redemption Peoria, you ladies, you don't have to be over 60. That was his context. But the ladies, you that would call yourselves seasoned, do you know we need you in this community? Like, I know culturally, like, we don't treat our elderly well in America at all. We kind of throw them away. Like, other cultures don't do that. But do you know how much we need you? We need your example. We need you to finish well. Man, we're not seeing people finish well because, again, we get in this culture of like, well, I've done my work. I'm going to retire. I'm done. I'm just going to ride off into the sunset, play golf, watch YouTube, whatever. And like, I put my time in. Plus, it doesn't really feel like you want me around. We want you around. Man, there's young women here. There's people here that need your investment. They need your spiritual input. Not that you're perfect. We need to hear where you failed, where you've succeeded in your kids and loving people as he gives this list. Like, we need you around. me just say I'm so thankful for the women that God has brought here that are in that stage of life that are investing. I'm not going to name your names. You know who you are. You're investing in us. You're investing in our community, and we need it. We are desperate for it. We need mothers and fathers in the church. We need brothers and sisters in the church. So please, please hear me. Get involved. Serve in some way. Be in a Bible study. Help serve with kids. There's plenty of ways for you to engage. And young people, hear me. Would we listen to the people that have gone before us? Man, when we learn from them, there is wealth and wisdom. Sit down with somebody older than you, whether it's a male or a female. Sit down with them and just ask them questions and learn from them. That's the way God's family is designed to work. And if a piece goes out of that because I don't feel valued or I just want to be comfortable, I served in the church for a long time. No, be Annas. I keep investing. We need your investment. Hear that plea from up front. And young people, would we please value the older people in our congregation? Not because they're the ones that pay the tithe, which they do, but because they have wisdom and life and experience and they've been walking with Jesus way longer than us. And sometimes we just don't give them the credit that they deserve. That's a really sad thing. And we need to do better. Let's do better. Paul is encouraging Timothy in that direction. And then this last section, as we kind of close out verse 11. So he gives this kind of like, again, he's giving a contrast. There's like there's dependent widows and there's these self-indulgent widows. Pay attention to these widows that have done these things. Allow them to invest in your community. And then he says this in verse 11. But he goes, but, he's doing another contrast, but refuse to enroll younger widows. For when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry. And so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. They're saying, man, okay, whether they've lost their husband or they don't have any tie to a male directly for a dependent, they go, I'm going to be all in for the church. And then like a month later, they go, well, actually, I met this dude and he's really cute. And so he's saying, like, just slow down. And then he says in verse 13, besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, give the adversary no occasion for slander, for some have already strayed after Satan. Verse 16, if any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened so that they may care for those who are truly widows. So Paul, again, he's giving this contrast, like, Paul, what's wrong with younger women? Like, why can't they be put on this list? And again, it's because he's saying, man, they can get pulled away from other things. Nothing wrong with wanting to be married. But again, understand the cultural context. In the cult of Artemis, she was saying, don't get married, don't have kids. And so that was kind of an acceptable standard for a woman that wasn't attached to a male. And Paul, again, is pressing against that. He's going, no, it's okay to get married. If God calls you to that, go do that. Have children. And again, it's not this stereotypical, like a woman has to be in the kitchen and their only worth is bearing children. We talked about that in chapter 2. I don't think that's what he's saying. But I do think he's pushing against the other end of the spectrum to go like, man, if you get married and you have kids, that is massively valuable. And his culture will go, I don't know how valuable it is. All culture today will go, I don't know how valuable it is. And if you're a mom, do you know how important that is? Do you know how you get to invest in that child? And so he's telling Timothy to help these women go, don't rule that out. If God calls you to that, go do that. That's okay. That's a good thing. That's an acceptable thing. If you're believing this cult of Artemis, you've already given yourself to Satan and this counterfeit gospel, this counterfeit way. And so again, contextually, he's opening up, going like, okay, pay attention to what that means. And then he ends, again, in verse 16, just going like, okay, let the family take care of the needs so that the church doesn't need to be burdened by it. But if the church needs to step in, the church will step in. The kingdom, again, calls for us to live a life of dependence rather than a life of indulgence. And when we consider this way of living, which is countercultural, because our world would just say, no, live a life of indulgence, just be comfortable. And dependence is hard. It's confusing. You don't always know, man, am I making the right decision? But this is what it means to follow Jesus. We only need to look one place for the perfect person that did this, and you know who it is. It's Jesus. He doesn't consider equality with God a thing to be grasped. Philippians 2 tells us, Paul tells us that. He doesn't stay in his indulgent, comfortable place in heaven with perfect relationship, with perfect harmony with the Father and the Spirit. He doesn't do that. What? He comes and empties himself, Philippians 2 says, in a way of dependence. Why would Jesus do that? If we're looking at the seat from Jesus' shoes, it's like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would you leave this perfect place of comfort to come and be dependent and have to walk around with us? It's because that's not the reason Jesus is doing it, is not for himself. He's doing it for you. He's doing it for me. Because that's the only way. As he looks at his creation, he goes, man, I love them. I love them. And as much as they want to try and do the right thing, they're always going to fail. And there's only one way to get back to me, and that's through the life of Jesus as he comes down, lives fully dependent on the Spirit, on the Father, and he dies a death that I deserve, that you deserve, because of our way of indulgence, because of our way of comfort. And he gives us the opportunity to know him. Jesus doesn't come down for his own benefit. He comes down for our benefit and for the glory of the Father, to be made right with God again. So as we walk through this life this week, I just hope this rings in your ears, even as you leave today. Man, this decision I'm making right now with this thing, with this conversation, with this purchase, am I living a life of indulgence? Is this just to give me comfort? Or am I living a life of dependence? Because again, it's not wrong to have two sinks. Don't walk out of here and say you got to actually put money back into having one sink. That's not what I mean. But are you praying about it? Are you living a life of dependence to go, God, is this what you want for us? And then are you listening to that? And then are you moving accordingly? Or are you just going, is this going to make me more comfortable? And the widow is a beautiful example of somebody that trusts God with everything she has. And that's what we need to be as followers of Jesus. So the question is, what do you want in life? What do you want in life? Right? Are you after happiness and money and freedom and all the things the world would tell us to go after? Or are you going, Jesus, I want you. And that's what I want more of. Right? And as we leave this morning thinking about, man, what do we want in life? Maybe the thing that we're trying to go after so hard is the thing we actually need to surrender so that we can get more of Jesus. And we all have those things. And so the hope and the goal of coming in this morning and looking at the scripture and allowing God to work in our hearts is to go, okay, what are the things I need to let go of so I can get more of Jesus? God, would you expose that to me, and would you help me release it so I can get more of you? Let's pray and ask him to do that. God, would you help us in this quest of dependence rather than indulgence? We're so inundated in the other direction. We just need you to shake us, to wake us up, to help us make right decisions that are actually going to be good for us in the long run, but maybe feel painful in the short run. Help us make those decisions well, whether it's financially, whether it's emotionally. God, we want to walk with you, Jesus. We want to be close to you. We know there's things that separate us from being close to you, and we want to release those things. So help us do that this morning, even as we respond. We ask it in your name. Amen.